done in the replit is I've created a separate div in the HTML for each of us so that we can work on our own parts in the same environment, look at each other's code, help each other out. So yeah, but if you're not using Replit, that's fine as well. Just share your screen or anything if you need my help. Yeah, just remember these divs can span countless lines. So if you want to you can put as many lines of code in there as you want. But yeah, so basically the task that we're going to be doing today is creating a ideally rotating, maybe that'll take us to next class if we want to continue it, but ideally a rotating bar that shows feedback or like content that's constantly updating. So if you've seen, okay, let me stop sharing my screen so I can show you guys what I'm talking about. So okay, so something like this. If you look at, oh wait, I'm not sharing my screen. One sec. Okay, so basically, once you guys can see my screen, this is basically something like this, where you see it's like you can rotate through the page by clicking on arrows to the left and right. And then inside here, whatever we want to put. So ideally for the website, the content would be like reviews from students or like comments they have, just things about the cloud classroom in general from our students. We want to share that with other prospective students as well. So that'll be the content we put there. But for the purposes of just summing this class up and practicing, we're just going to focus on creating like this tool in itself. So before we actually begin coding, a good practice is always to think through what goes in the HTML, the general structure, what will go in the CSS, and what will go in the JavaScript. So first, I like to just have this visual here. The first thing that we're going to need to do, and guys, for today, because this is like a practice session, if you guys, like as I'm talking through this, just feel free to unmute, speak up, interrupt me, or type in the chat. Because this is something that like I'm actively working on as well. So you guys are just part of the actual coding process for this. So yeah, so what I would do like starting right now, looking at this visual of what I want to create, for the HTML, I would first start to think, okay, this isn't going to be the only thing on the web page. So I need to make sure that this is within its own, this is its own element. The simplest thing would just be a div because it can span many lines. So I would just create a div for this whole box. The next thing would probably be thinking about these arrows on the sides. So one of the major functions of this is that it can cycle through things to focus on different pieces of information. And so these arrows, even though you can't visually tell that they're like a separate part of this div, they're going to be buttons, or at least elements that when you click on it, when you see the click event, it'll do something in the JavaScript. Now, the easiest thing for that is just the button, which is already there. So I'm going to need a div. I'm going to need two buttons. I'm also going to need some actual content on here. For now, I'm just going to ignore like the three dots on the bottom, which shows how many reviews there actually are and how many pages I can cycle through. If we have time at the end, we can focus on these as well. But for now, I think the three biggest things are just the actual content and then the buttons on the sides. Okay, so that's it for the HTML. For the CSS, I would like to think that we should create just like a button that actually looks like a button. Because if you guys remember in HTML, the button element doesn't actually show up. It's just like a gray box. So we want to put some arrows in there to indicate that it's a button to cycle through things. And then the other big thing is just being able to cycle through the pages themselves. You'll notice that on a lot of pages, when you click through things, there will be like a fade in and out effect. Um, Now that's something that we can add at the end. That's not really important. In case we run out of time, I want to focus on the major things. But you can also achieve the same thing in JavaScript. And then, yeah, for JavaScript, the one major thing is just keeping like a list of content that you actually want to show, and then only showing one at a time and then cycling through those. Yeah, I think that's it. Okay, so with that in mind, I'm back in the Replit. So I'm just gonna work in this div that I've created for myself down here. The first thing is, okay, let me run this so we're not seeing the subscribe button. Okay, so remember the HTML, the first thing we want to do is create the div. Now that's already here. So I'm just going to assume that for each of us, as we're coding, for each of us, we're going to be creating like our own bar. And each of us is creating like a duplicate of the navigation bar. So I have the outermost div. The first two things that I want to put in are buttons for cycling through. So I'm going to create two buttons here. And just to differentiate them, I'm going to give them an ID. So the first one would be back. The second one, I'll just call it next. And then for the actual content in here, we talked about wanting to put in like the actual arrow symbol. So one of the things that you can do is literally just use the greater than or less than signs. And whenever you start using like dots or slashes or greater than less than signs, whenever you're using not characters or numbers between HTML tags, you want to make sure that what you're using isn't going to be interpreted by HTML as something else. So for example, if we were going to put the arrows like forward or back, as you can notice, these are already being used by the tags. So like if I forgot or if I didn't know what this, if it would mess things up, then I would probably just go search it up right now. Can I have greater than sign in HTML? And let's see. So, okay, yeah, for today's class, guys, like you really don't have to like follow along with everything that I'm doing. Like feel free to Google things on your own or search up things that you're curious about. Change the design of your own navigation bar. We're just creating the same thing, but we can customize it as well. So I'm just literally taking you through exactly how I would go about a task. And for example, right, so see in here, I would briefly skim this and see, okay, yeah, the greater than less than sign, as I suspected, is something that's going to be misinterpreted by the HTML. And so as you go through this project, you realize, if you don't already have experience in programming, that a lot of programming is Googling things, reading things, learning about things on the go. So this is perfectly normal and perfectly fine. But yeah, so I'm going to use something called HTML entities. I don't really care what that is. What you need to know is that they're preceded by an ampersand and then semicolon. It's almost like JavaScript when it's denoting the beginning and ending of a line. So this right here is the greater than symbol, which is exactly what we want. And then you can also have the less than symbol, which I believe is LT. Let's just check. This is a handy chart greater than less than, yeah, LT. Okay, so with that in mind, now we can go back to here and remember to use an entity ampersand greater than, and then a semicolon. And then here we want, oops, the back button should be the less than sign. And then the forward button should be a ampersand and then greater than sign and then semicolon. Okay. So now we have two basic buttons. Let's just run this to see what it looks like. Okay. So, okay, you'll notice that my buttons are currently red and have certain features in them because I added some styles last time for our subscribe button demo. Don't worry about those now. We can change the styles after the HTML, but this is good. We have the two basic forward and back arrows. Now, the next thing we want to do is actually create the content. So I'm going to create a div. This is the most basic one that I would. So create a div and let's say student reviews about Cloud Classroom. Okay, and now if I run this, what does that look like? You're gonna see something weird. So it's shifted the buttons, one on top and one on bottom. So if you guys remember, when we learned about HTML, certain tags are gonna have certain backend features already. And one of the properties that a div has is that it's gonna try and maintain its own line. So it's not going to allow anything else to be on the same line as it. Now it can have things within it. One div can span multiple lines, but that div within itself isn't going to share a line with other places, with other elements. So what do I want to do now? If you guys remember, one of the things that I briefly mentioned in the HTML was a span, which doesn't have this problem. But again, so let's just pretend that we came upon this issue and we don't know how to solve it. Why is my div on a different line, HTML, right? Because they're a block element, right? I didn't teach you guys this term, but any element that pushes things to the other lines tries to maintain its own line. That's called a block line, block element, sorry. So you can get something from this blurb. You can set things to like no wrap. You can use some properties in there, but the simplest thing is to actually use a span. So here, so yeah, see the span and a remember being like a link, those are already in line. So as opposed to block elements which preserve their own lines, spans and a elements are going to be in their own line. So we quickly learn about that. We can go right back to our code and just change this into spans. And now if I run this, it should be all on one line. Okay, great. So now, let's see. Okay, so now the next thing that we want to do is, well, okay, that's actually it for the basic HTML that we just went over and laid out. But given that this, actually, you know what, let's do the CSS and JavaScript first and then add any extra things. So, okay, let's see. Okay, let's do CSS. Okay, let's do CSS briefly. So notice how my buttons currently are red and have this sort of feature here. Let's just keep that for now. But the Cloud Classroom, its themes are like blue and cyan and all of those things. So I'm going to change that to blue. And these look kind of wide. So, well, let's just run this to see. Okay, so this looks kind of, okay, I also want this to be blue. So through a lot of experimentation, CSS is really about experimentation visualizing, which is something really good about Replit. Yeah, okay. So now see, one of the major issues that I'm seeing here is that the content here is actually really, really close to the buttons. And it just feels really squashed. So I want to put some margins between that. Now, one of the things that, for example, if you found this template in here, which a lot of people will do, like search up a template for a button online, for the CSS online. Now you might be tempted to use the padding here and change the width between the buttons and the actual content. So let's just try that to see what happens. If I change it to 40, now you see it's actually creating making the button itself wider. That's because the padding is between the content in the button and then the border that we're talking about. So let's go back to, well, let's do 10. Let's see how that looks. Okay, that looks good as well. So I want to do something to the border and the div itself. So how do I do that? Let's just go through what we have right now. So not font size, the border itself, if I thicken the border, it's still that close to the actual content. If I do something to the border radius, remember the radius is what makes the edges here a little bit curved. So it's not going to be that, not background color, not cursor, not transition. So I don't have any properties in here yet. Now, let's talk about, well, okay, one of the things that you might have noticed is that within the body, or like the default CSSs, we have this thing called margins. And if you remember the box layout that I mentioned in our CSS lesson, or last week, I think as well, this is what's actually going to separate this. So you could have Googled this, you could have looked at other things, but basically, let's add a margin of 10. And if I run that, okay, let's make it more obvious. Okay, for some reason, this isn't. Okay, well, time for Googling again. So why, okay, button margin properties CSS. Margin properties CSS. No, that's okay. CSS margin. So, okay, so it's going to create space around elements outside of any defined borders. So technically it should work for a button. We can specify specific ones for top, right, bottom, left. Maybe this is the issue, but for now I'm going to assume that, margin is also going to apply just like as itself, right? See, it's a shorthand property for all of those. Oh, okay. So maybe this is why. So let's copy this and see if this works. Maybe it needs 4 values as opposed to the body element, because body within itself is like all the displayed content is within there, so you can't really have margins outside of that. But see, once we load this, we immediately see, okay, now my button has somehow jumped a different line. Now, why is that? It might be because, oh, see, if we notice the space from this button to the edge of our screen, this width, if we eyeball it, plus the button is going to be too wide for the remaining space on that line. So this is actually not an issue with the HTML. It's not because these are block elements. They're all inline elements. So because we experimented before with various HTML elements, we now know, okay, this is not going to be an HTML element. We're going to actually need to focus on the CSS and change something there. So we might look at this and see, okay, so what I might need to change is just the actual margins. If it's too wide, it's going to push it off the screen. So let's change all of these to be a little smaller. Let's change them all to be 10. And I run that again. Okay, great. Now all of them are here. And see, the space has turned a little bit wider. So let's just change them to 20 pixels. Let's see. Oh, wait, that's the front one. You won't be able to see that. As well as this one. I think, okay, let's see. Run that again. It gets wider. Okay, great. So now I just want to experiment. Maybe I don't need to write it 4 times and have it be redundant. if I only write it one time, right, the shorthand property kicks in, it applies to all four of them. So what I was missing before was actually the pixel property, the units on my actual value. So now for future reference, I'll be able to keep in mind, okay, I always need a unit with values in CSS. Okay, now that we've tackled the most basic things, let's create something that actually defines my div as a bar as well. Because let's pretend that this screen on the right is just my web page. If I suddenly see a line of text with two buttons on the sides, it feels very almost too connected to the rest of the web page. We want this to stand out as something on its own. So how do I do that? I wanted to apply that to the whole thing. So what should my CSS apply to? Feel free to speak up or type in the chat. What do you guys think? And if you don't know, it's fine. I'll just show you guys after. So remember, we want the CSS. We want to define this. We want to make this entire section stand out. So how do I make CSS that applies to both the buttons and the content inside? Any ideas? If not, that's fine. What I was Okay, if not, perfectly fine. So remember, all of this right now is within a div. So remember, I've put all of this within one div so that, I can specify this as one part of the web page, not just the body, because my body is going to be my entire web page. I'm going to have so much on here. Now, what I want to do is, if I go back to this, yeah, okay. So first, remember, we want to access this div. So how might I access it? There's so many divs here. What I want to do is use my ID. So I'm just going to keep my name here for now so that if you guys choose to, feel free to copy my code into your divs as well, play around with the CSS as well. But basically, I'm going to go back into here, and if I want to select my div using my ID, remember IDs are accessed using the pound signal or the hashtag. So hashtag, and then my ID was my name. So in here, this is going to apply to all of this. So I don't know, let's create a border to make it stand out. And let's just make it the same as the buttons for now, for simplicity. We can change all of this later if we want, but let's just run that to see what it looks like now. Okay, great. So now my bar actually stands out from the rest of the web page. And oh yeah, I see Eden, you're playing around with the buttons here. Don't worry, like another thing we can go do, this is good practice for CSS selectors as well. We can create different button settings for everyone. So I'm gonna make sure that my div has this property, but now I'm gonna create a so I'm gonna create, I want to create certain styles for my button. So let me just copy all of this into here. Okay. So now if I reload this, this should only apply to my buttons. So if we run that, oops. Let's see what's going on. We need see, remember my ID was from the div, not actually the button. So it's impossible for my ID to apply to both a button and the div using this element. So what else would I do? Well, I would need a button that, well, let's see, how can we select this button element specifically? I could maybe, I could create a new ID for it, but that might also get redundant because I want it to apply to both of these buttons. So you'll notice that a lot of CSS selectors is about making things really concise because it'll get really long really quickly. So maybe I should create a class for these so that I can select both of them at the same time. So let's create a class and let's call it button Dabao. And same here, I'm gonna create this class. Okay. So if I go back here, now I want this to apply to, I've created a class. And remember, CSS selectors for classes use a dot. So button Dabao. And if I run this again, this should render the same thing that we saw before. Yep. Okay, but let's see, why is this here now? We've had, let's go back here. Oh, okay, that's because, right, you've created a button down here. Okay, no worries about that. Now let's figure out why is this off-centered? I want this to be in the center of my page. So let's go back here and let's see. All right, I want to create this. I want to copy these styles over here as well. So, but remember this button is dot button. So if I run that again, now my hover applies. So, okay, great. So remember you can use multiple selectors. Okay, but back to why this is off-centered. Let's see. I could just center everything within my div. So why don't we do that? Let's do justify content center. Now, before I run this again, notice why this is going on. Remember the body right here is a, it already has a property called justify content. When I'm using my when I'm creating nested selectors, then it's overriding the previous CSS. So the more narrow your selectors are, they're gonna override the more broad ones. So if I run this now this should be centered, right? Because I've added this justify content to also apply to my div, which is enclosing my entire navigation bar. Okay, now we've gotten all the basic CSS. Now comes the hard part, I guess. The functionality. How do we actually make this cycle through? Now, before we actually go into the JavaScript, one thing that I want to point out is that the actual content should always be within the HTML. So let's say that I have a, okay, so keep that for now. So let's just create another span for now. And let's say this is review number 2. And let's just create another one. So we have, let's say we have 3 reviews that we want to cycle through. If I run this right now, all of them are going to be placed and shown at the same time. So how do I create something that's not going to be shown? Well, that's going to be something related to CSS. But let's just search it up. So let's see, there was a cool article in here about that. It's about visibility. So CSS visibility attribute. Okay. Right. Okay. So there's a visibility CSS that we could apply. Let's think about how we want to do this. So we need to be able to change the CSS. So we don't really want to just put all the CSS in line. So I don't want to say, okay, visibility is going to equal to hidden right here. I want to do it all together so that they can change. But we also need a way for these. I don't want to recreate the CSS using JavaScript every time. So how about we use some sort of, we create the CSS and then we change the identifiers on these 3 spans so that these identifiers will have those styles. So what I mean is this. So for example, I'm just going to create a, let's create a class because this is going to apply to multiple things. Let's create a class called visible. Okay. And within here, I'm just, oops, okay, visibility. Okay. And then the other one is hidden. So I also want to create a class called hidden. This is going to make it much easier for us to access the, for us to apply these things to many different parts of our HTML. So now let's go back and remember, I haven't applied these classes to any of the elements yet. So just for demonstration purposes, let's apply this to class roles. Let's call this hidden. Now, if I run this, we should only see the first one. But notice how these right here are still taking up space. We can't see it, but it's still off center. So how do we actually make the text here centered as well? You'll notice that as we code through this, like we will be solving one problem, but as we do that, there'll be so many small problems that pop out along the way as well. That's perfectly natural. It might be frustrating at times, but we've just got to deal. So how do I somehow make these two not affect the position of the top one? Well, one idea that we might have is to actually create like a different line for each of these reviews. But if we did that, remember, this might be centered in the middle, but now it's not going to be centered top to bottom. These are going to take up space all the time. So maybe let's just search up how to make CSS or how to make HTML element okay, this is a good, yeah, let's see if it's always on top. We can create coordinates. So remember how we can create, or actually I didn't go over that. Okay, you know what, I'll show you guys through this article. But basically what we want to do is use something called a z-index. So a z-index is, think about all of the things that we've been talking about so far in 2 dimensions, right? So x, y coordinates. This is, for example, this has some x, some y. But if I suddenly add a z coordinate into there, I'm going to be able to overlap these things. And now it's not actually going to be 3D, but some content is just going to be on top of others, and that's still a 3D effect. So that's why it's called a z-index. So I'm going to create different z-indexes for each of these things so that they can overlap. Okay, so I'm just going to ignore some of these for now, but notice the z-index attribute. So the z-index attribute, let me just add this in here so I can show you guys. Okay, this is actually a good example of when it would be good to use inline CSS. So here, for example, if I would do z-index, or actually, I still don't want to do that, but okay. One way that we can make it even more concise, but maybe a little harder to read, is if we actually add all of the hidden elements aren't going to be seen anyways. So we really don't care if they're all on the same z-index. So why don't we just make all of the hidden ones have a z-index of, let's say like 2. The default is 1, I believe. Now on the visible, we have to specify the index is going to be equal to 1. So if I run this now, why is that happening? Let's see, these should be on different z indexes. Perhaps it's overriding the just. Okay, let's run that and see. Nope, not that problem. Z index. Perhaps. Let's see. Z index. Let's read more about Z index. Is it something that has to be done to, well, okay, there isn't much description here. Why don't we try using a negative Z index? So let's create, this one is -1, and this is going to be -2. So if I run this, it's weird. Let's see, how do we make them overlap? So CSS text overlap. Okay, so let's see, line height property, reduce the height of each line of text. Well, let's read their code. This is very unreadable. This is a good example of what you don't want to do. So let's see, to expand cursive fonts. Okay, word spacing, line height. Okay. Well, the one major thing that seems to be changing is the line height. So why don't we try that? Let's change this to line height equals to 10 pixels. And let's run this and see what happens. Okay, maybe we need to change this one as well. Sorry guys, I don't know why my Replit is being so laggy today. Perhaps they need to be different. So, okay. Well, we have 15 minutes left of class. We can fix this next time if we want to continue with this or we have time. But before, at the very least, in case we change topics next time, I want to show you guys the functionalities. So what you actually want to do is, we have the 3 major components already. What we want to do is, let's go. Well, first of all, remember we need to construct a variable. So I didn't really talk about it last time. Const is another way of saying var, except const you can't really change. So like I will not be able to edit this afterwards, but you want that sometimes. So let's just do that for now. Document.getElement by ID, and this is a good time to go back and see, okay, maybe I need an ID in here as well. So I'm going to call this review 2, shortened to R2 or R3. Similarly, I'm going to need one here. So ID equals R1. Okay. Now, if I go back into here, I can get my element by its IDs. So this is going to be R1, and I want to do this for all 3. So okay, now let's change this to view 2, view 3. Okay. Now what I want to do is actually dynamically change its CSS so that some will be showing at certain times and some will be showing at other times. So what I want to do is here, I'm going to do, okay, let's see. So right now, review 2 and review 3 can't be seen. So the next one that we want to show is review 2. When that happens, I'm gonna create, okay, let's say that everything that's gonna be triggered by a button. So, okay, again, we need to create the button element. Forgot about that. Okay, what? So forward f equals. And then same thing. Oops. Type next. And then this is the back button. So I'm just gonna call it the button. And now what I want to do is add an event listener. If you guys remember, I left this up here so that we can use it as a template. You guys might find this more familiar because we used it last class, but we're going to add an event listener. Now with the button, you can always say on click because that's just a property specific to the buttons. But as with any code, you want to make things reasonably generic so that you're not using a ton of stuff that only applies to one specific type of HTML element. So I'm still going to use the add event listener. So let's talk about going forward first. So the forward button, I'm going to add an event listener. And in this case, it's going to be a click. And this is, remember, the function symbol. So within here is what's going to happen when somebody clicks. Now, I want to show the next review, which in this case is going to be review 2. So I'm going to say review 2. And because we're changing the CSS, we need to access it through the styles. So, well, let's say that we forgot how to access it. How to access CSS properties from Java. Oops, from JavaScript. Okay. Well, let's see. CSS can be CSS. Oops. Okay. If we go down here in my script, I'm accessing the styles by. Let's see. CSS. Okay. CSS dot style. Okay, sometimes you're going to come across articles that aren't helpful, a lot of times actually. So CSS properties dot get CSS text. Okay, maybe we should how to change CSS properties. Maybe that's better. So let's see. Right, I showed you this article last time. So get element by ID right. So this is exactly what I was using before. So dot style, and then we need the property. So the property here is going to be the visibility. Now I'm going to assign this something. Remember, in JavaScript, assigning is still going to be an equation equal sign, not like CSS where it's a colon. So here I'm going to assign it. My review 2 is the one I want to show now. So I'm going to say, okay, now I want to make this visible. And so what I'm doing is essentially, if I go back to the HTML, I'm changing this ID 2. So ID for review 2 right here, this span. Notice how it has a class hidden. This is what it starts with. But once someone clicks on the next arrow, I'm going to I'm going to make the class into visible. So it's actually going to dynamically change. And because we're loading the JavaScript, remember in the HTML, because we load the JavaScript at the very end of the bottom, they're going to override things. And this is going to consistently update. So I'm making this visible, but now I need to make review 1 invisible. So now I'm going to access its style equals, and notice how we didn't give it a class yet. So this is something that you need to do if you're going to access it within JavaScript using the style property. If you don't have the property, you can't access it. There's different ways to add a new one, but just to keep things consistent, I'm just gonna add a visible class here and then go back to here. Now I want to make this hidden. Okay, so let's run this now and experiment. If I click the forward button, oops, okay, I might have to add quotation marks here. On this, and oh, right, this is because we used classes, not the actual CSS. So remember, how to change HTML element class in JavaScript? Right. Okay. Change the elements, give some selectors, change the element class JavaScript. So class name equals. Oops. And ID in my script, see, they're getting the element, they're getting its class name. Okay, now they're just directly assigning it. So let's try that as well. Instead of the actual CSS property, let's do a class name. Is there a camel case? Yes. And by camel case, I mean capitalizing words when there's a new word. So class name, and I'm just going to change. Remember, I define these classes in here. One is visible, one is classes, one is hidden. So these classes I can just directly change, even though they're like CSS keywords. So now if I click this button, what is going on? Let's see. Oh, perhaps. Let's try this. Okay, well, let's try to debug this issue as well. I hope we have time for this today. We're going a bit longer than I expected. But so we have a forward button. This should have accessed my element. Let's just make sure that the ID is correct. Yes, we do have a button with its ID called next. So we access the correct element. Now we're adding an event listener. My click should have triggered something. I did click something. My function is to style. Oh, I'm still accessing the style part of this. So remember, when we're accessing, this is the HTML. So we don't actually need the style here. That's why. So if we do this now, let's see if this works. Okay, there's still something weird going on. To name. Perhaps. If you guys notice something, let me know as well. But basically, we need a document. We access the element. On. Yeah, I'm just gonna try something real quick. This. Okay. One. Let's see. What is making this not work? Okay. No. Okay, I think I know what the issue is. We need to, let me, okay, this is, let me see. If this works, let me just quickly try this. And if this works, I'll explain what went on. So, okay, what I was trying here was because remember when I said that a const keyword in JavaScript isn't going to allow for any edits to be made. I was going to try a let or a var, which is things that you can change. But let's see, perhaps if work. Nope, not that either. So what else is there? Okay. Well, I was gonna take you guys through the debugging process, but as we're short on time, I'm gonna open up a ChatGPT thing to ask it, why is this not acting on? Like this is like a demonstration of how ChatGPT is really, really useful for coding, but especially web design. So let's read this real quick. The code between users IDs actually match. Yes, they match. Execution, the JavaScript code. Yes, it's placed after CSS classes. This one is CSS. Okay, well, this is a good suggestion. Let's see if this is actually showing. So if I run this now, oops, let's rerun that. If I click the next button, okay, so button has not been clicked. Well, let's try see if this works. Alert should bring out something like that your web browser actually shows, like the pop-ups on the top. So because this actually isn't showing at all, this means that this line isn't being executed at all. So this button simply isn't registering that it's being clicked. It hasn't even gotten in here. So it's not any issue within here. Now let's figure out why. Well, okay, we have 1 minute of class left. Sorry about that. But basically, let me just really quickly recap what we were trying to do here. So now that we've pinpointed the problem, we can just fix that. But after this button has been clicked, we basically want to toggle the classes in CSS that we've created before so that it changes visibility. And now you might be wondering, how do we keep track of which one is the current one that's visible? Well, then we could create another variable. And because we're ordering these by page, like review number 1, review number 2, etc., we can create like a list, like an array or a variable that simply keeps track and counts which one we're currently at. And each time we click, depending on whether it was the forward button or the back button, we can change that number. So if it was the forward button, we could maybe add 1. If it was the back button, we could -1. So that's the functionality part of this, and we would be able to cycle through. After that, it would simply be a matter of adding like a automation. So for example, every X number of seconds, execute the function that we've already written to be manually done when there's a button. So basically, we've gone through like the basic components. We've gone through the HTML, we've gone through the CSS. We didn't quite get through the JavaScript. Sorry about that. We took a bit longer than I expected, but I hope you guys learned something today. Experience like how web development actually is. And next class, yeah, we can either continue doing this or do something else. feel free to let me know right now before next class or even at the beginning of next class. We can decide what we want to do then. But thanks for coming. That's it for class today. See you guys.